Hello everybody, and welcome to another live stream. Oh, sorry, the music's not on. Let me just add that back on. So for today's live stream, I'm actually going to be going through the finished image, because I did actually do a lot of work on the side just to finish it up. I also did some tests with some of the extra foreground elements that you didn't actually see me paint on stream, but I will give you an update today on where I ended with those images. So first off, let me just turn on the chat here so you guys can actually respond if you want to, and show you the image. So this is actually the finalized image. I decided in the end, even after painting some of the additional foreground elements, that this image did not need those foreground elements. It actually worked better without it. So I actually took those out entirely. I do have some of these rocks that are actually more in the forefront anyway, but I took it out because it just didn't work aesthetically. So I'll show you those in a moment, but I just want to go through some of the changes that I did off camera essentially. So let me just go in here. I went in and I actually added a lot of texture work onto the different layers. I also darkened up this area here. I finished painting and adding details to the rock elements, as you can see, and that was actually most of it. But something that's a little less noticeable is I actually added some fog on some of these elements, just so that they actually look more separated from each other. So you can actually see essentially where the atmosphere is actually causing that separation. So that when you zoom out, everything's not blending in as much. Now in the initial sketch for this image, let me see if we can find a line art for that. Yeah, so it's this object and this object here. I'll just bring these guys up to full opacity for you guys. So I did have originally this object in this image. However, once I painted it, it definitely didn't look, it looked out of place. So I ended up actually taking it out entirely, which is unfortunate, but it does happen. I think what would have worked better is maybe if I either made it bigger or smaller. I think actually, honestly, just making it smaller would have actually helped a lot, and moving it somewhere over here instead. Now, because of the perspective I've already added in it, it wouldn't make sense if I just rescaled it and put it there. So for now, at least, I've removed this, but I did paint it just to see if it would work, just to make sure. So the other element was this foreground element. So this one was intentionally supposed to actually cover up a lot of these elements here. However, it ended up covering it too much. And I ended up with, because of the rocks behind it, with a lot of tangents, which is something that you do try to avoid at all costs. So essentially this area here is actually all blending in together. And it didn't matter how much fog I added in, it still didn't seem to fit properly. So once again, I moved that out. Once again, it could have been an issue of just essentially moving this over. Something like that might have worked. Or even moving it here. That way there's nothing in front of it. But it wouldn't have worked with the current perspective, so I would actually have to redraw that if that's the case. So rather than doing that, I did paint them. So that's the original object there. Once again, I do think it would have worked better if I just moved it, and this object here. So you can see though, the main problem is that they just blend in too much. And there's not much I could do now for that, just because the colors are too close. They just blend in. So I took them out, and it just looks stronger without it, and it was a call I essentially had to make on this, because essentially the overall image matters more than just those two elements. Now I did include them for my actual portfolio, which you guys don't generally see too often on my streams. I did include it in my portfolio, but I include them as a separate element entirely. So what I did, I'll show you how I actually did this. Size doesn't really matter in this case. I think I did a like 2:5 ratio or something similar to that. Oh, let me just rotate it. Okay. So all I did is with these two elements here, is I copy these guys, put them in here. Did not realize they were scaled so big. I didn't check. Now obviously this is going to be slightly different just because I'm not looking at my actual portfolio at the moment. But I rescaled these, offset them slightly, and created essentially a black fill background behind them. Should I have black here? Yeah. So that if I have the painted portions right next to my line work, I still showcase that I did actually paint them. I did try to paint them, but I'm trying to showcase them in essentially the most positive manner that I can. But aesthetically, I had to remove them. So I essentially have this main background, and then I have below it these two elements here, and then beside it I have actually the line work. So that's how I was able to still use them for something, because these essentially are more like a prop now, just because I won't actually be able to use them in the rest of the portfolio as much. But it is good to show that, you know, you've done the work. It's just you haven't forgotten the objects, or to modify the line work so you don't even see it, which I may actually re-export them and then make essentially a separate model sheet for it. Doing that would actually be another way of doing this, where you could actually, let's say, this would be a bit dark if that's the case. Choosing an off-white is kind of a good idea unless you have actual color. No, yeah, I do have the artwork, the line art here. So in this case, I would have brought these back in here. Once again, they're going to be huge. Essentially use it as a template to make a model sheet for it. Okay. And change the size. Now the height actually needs to pretty much be doubled, so we'll make it even. And this is something I actually do regularly for my pieces. I'll just, if it doesn't, it's not well suited for one thing, you can generally use it for something else. And just separate out the two elements. So I might have that there and that. You would normally put them on two separate pages. I do tend to group these so I can find them easier. So I might separate both of these and then write some descriptive text in case I have to come back to it. Essentially what would be the story on this? So maybe this is like, it looks like machinery, it looks like almost something that's been submerged, because it is, but maybe it's like a pylon that helps crank like mobile machinery. So maybe it's a mobile unit, wreckage. Wreckage, however you spell wreckage, which I'm going to look up because this is going to be permanently on YouTube. Okay. Cool. Okay, so now we have a description. I would definitely change the font on this. I typically wouldn't use this type of font. Which one do I have right now? I do have a particular font I tend to use for most of my stuff. You have to actually be pretty particular with your fonts in general. And it kind of needs to suit the theme, so I actually spend a lot of time choosing my font. Obviously I'm not going to do as much of a good job because I'm showing you guys quickly. But essentially the shape should kind of actually match the theme. But it shouldn't be overdone either. So some of these do have textures, because I have actually quite a few fonts here. But it needs to be clear to read as well. I'm actually looking for one without any of those little tiny details in it. Might take longer than I expected. I also normally set up like a couple of options. I'm just going to use this one for now. It's actually not a good font for this, but no. Let's do two of them. It's big. So maybe this is the main title for it, and then this part might just be one of the pylons for it. Pylon. We'll just put pylon on there. Definitely do a smaller font. I'm definitely going to change the font in this one because you can't read it. Sure. All right. So maybe this actually occurred after several years. So you're giving it a little bit of a story. So in this case, we'll say it happened in year 3000. Once again, it's not realistic, but it doesn't need to be in this case as an example. And I'll just copy and paste this. Oh. Okay. Okay. Central, maybe this is like the central part of it, central tower or something, and we'll just call it that. And once again, give it a date. And you have essentially this is a really rough model sheet. Generally you would show a couple different locations. In this case, because I gave it a story, and this is a wreckage after an event, then what I would have actually done is I would have actually done the building that was what it looked like before. So unflooded. So it would show the whole city below it. Assuming that was actually what had occurred. And I do normally add a little bit of like small details, so sometimes I might add a bit of a border, but I do try to minimize that. And I do try to add like functional elements, so so maybe this is the central tower, but maybe this area here is actually an area where there's like a beam of light that comes out of it, or it's a power source location. Maybe this gear actually has a function behind it, then would add a function to it. So these are all things that I would do to an image or a portion of image if I was intending essentially not to waste it, because I've already done the work on it. So I might just build those elements as additional portions, so that I still have this portion here that makes more sense. The composition works, but I'm also showcasing some of the other elements of this world. So I'm essentially giving another use for it. So I may actually also use this as a completely different inspiration for another background. That's also entirely possible. Excuse me, that's entirely possible as well. There's no reason why I can't, because I've already done the work on it. Now, overall, because I was actually testing out this software, Affinity Designer, when it came to painting, it works actually pretty darn good. Once you get around some things, like there's some minor things where it'll switch out of the gradient, or it'll just like flatten it, which I'm not too fond of, but you do kind of learn how to work around it. I did find the easiest way for doing essentially this style painting was to make sure you had your gradient on it. That way you had a flat color, and this software does work way better with flat colors than it does with working with subgroup particles and effects below your main layers, because I do find that sometimes, because it is essentially acting as a mask, it can interfere with your colors that you're trying to achieve, because it is essentially working kind of backwards from Photoshop. But that being said, it also works better in some ways, because I could do an infinity amount essentially of sublayers within sublayers. So the way it's organized is actually very intriguing to me, because it does offer quite a bit of flexibility. But it can also cause other issues to arise as well. So there are some things I still need to finish up and polish, like this part of the building I'm probably going to finish up. But other than that, this image is pretty much done. Like I said, I did a lot of work on the side. A lot of it was actually to do with water. So the nice thing is you could actually switch with Affinity Designer to pixel mode, which allows you to paint with an actual brush, which is actually very refreshing and nice compared to other softwares and other competitors. And I did do several layers essentially of the seawater. So if we go in closer, you'll see that there's actually a slight line here in the water's edge, and I've made sure to do the gradients on that just to make it read. But for the actual waves, to make it more painterly, I actually just used the texture brush that actually comes with the software, and that's it. I may go in later though and add a bit of blades of grass in here just to make these actually work together a bit more. But other than that, it's actually pretty good. So I hope you guys enjoyed this live stream, and I hope to see you guys soon. So thank you and take care.